Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. This is one of the most enjoyable and informative meetings that I've attended in a long time. So, GI and as a measure of carbohydrate quality. So that picture there epitomizes what glycemic index means to me without any change in macronutrient composition or fiber content. I've increased the GI from about 48 through to about 50 in instant oats. All right, so disclosure of commercial support. So I'm getting some funding, I hope, for the trip between Boston and Toronto. All right. We'll see how you do. But that's all. Usually I pay my way everywhere. Okay, so relationships with commercial interests. I am the director of a not-for-profit glycemic index research service at the University of Sydney. I'm a director of the Glycemic Index Foundation, which is a not-for-profit, and I'm the co-author of several books about the glycemic index, the latest of which is High Protein, Low GI, and it's called World's Best Diet. Okay, so mitigating potential bias. All my information that I show you today is published or under second review in one case. My highest priority is actually to improve public health, but only through enjoyment of food, of good food. So the funny thing is my duality of interest arises because I've chosen to translate my research into real-world solutions, so that philosophy has come back to bite me. Okay, so carbohydrate quality, we need a new paradigm. First of all, some carbohydrates may increase the risk of chronic disease, as we've heard, but some carbohydrate foods may also be protective. And not just via their glycemic effects, but by the co-travelers, I call them, the accompanying nutrients and micronutrients. So we need to differentiate between carbohydrate-rich foods, and we need a marker of overall carbohydrate quality. So, but what is a good carbohydrate, and are we all going to agree? So, whole grain, perhaps? Does a carbohydrate have to be whole grain? Does it have to be high in fiber? Does it need to be higher in micronutrients? Should it be low in added sugar? Or perhaps that doesn't matter as long as it's solid. Perhaps just not in solution. Or should it be low glycemic index? And perhaps we could also tick all of the above, and some combination of all of the above might be the best index of carbohydrate quality or carbohydrate food quality. So a novel carbohydrate quality index was introduced by a team of Spanish scientists, and I really do hand it to the Spanish people in the audience that some really nice studies are coming out of Spain, including the PREDIMED study. So in both of these studies, they used a 136-item semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire. They're the two papers there, recently published, and they came up with their carbohydrate quality index by summing 4 criteria. One was glycemic index, one was the ratio of whole grains to total grains, one was the ratio of solid carbohydrate divided by the sum of the solid plus the liquid carbohydrate, and one was the fiber content per serving. So basically they used the quintiles for each of those and used a score with a total value of 20, so it varied between 4 and 20, and the higher it was, the better the quality, or the quality index, carbohydrate quality index of the diet. So what they did was then analysed quintiles of carbohydrate quality index and looked at it as a function of failing to meet. So this is a concept that we need to kind of take on board. It was the odds of failing to meet either 4 or 8 recommended micronutrient intakes. So the first study was the SUN study, 16,000, 17,000 healthy Spanish subjects, mean age 39, 40% male, BMI 24, so pretty normal. And what they found was that the higher the carbohydrate quality index, the smaller the odds of failing to meet. Okay, the smaller the odds of failing to meet. So it's a bit of a tricky concept there, but you're more likely to get more micronutrients if your carbohydrate quality index is high. Okay, and they adjusted for energy and they adjusted for total carbohydrate. So the second study was done in 6,500. It's actually the Predimed study itself, mean age 67. So this is what happened. This is their diet at baseline. Again, 40% male, but this time much higher in BMI. And what they found, again, they're looking at quintiles. So the higher the quintile of carbohydrate quality index, the smaller the odds of failing to meet 8 recommended dietary intakes. So again, it's giving you what you'd like. You're more likely to get micronutrients, high levels of micronutrients, if you're improving the quality of your carbohydrate intake. Okay, so let's look at the other possible marker of food quality. It's the fat quality index, all right? So they introduced this in their papers as well. And it was the ratio of mono plus puffer divided by the SAFA and trans fats, the saturated and trans fats. And so the higher the fat quality index, the better the types of fatty acids in the diet, okay? And again, they did quintiles of fat quality index, adjusted this time for both energy and total fat intake, and they looked at the risk of failing to meet 8 recommended dietary intakes. And lo and behold, it's perhaps the opposite to what you expect. The better the quality of the fat in the diet, the more likely they were to fail to meet their recommended dietary intake. It came as a surprise to me, all right? But the reason, when you think about it, is because if you improve the quality of your diet by reducing fat in your diet, by reducing fat and dairy intake, the chances are you've reduced the intake of a lot of micronutrient-rich foods like iron and calcium, okay? So I think that's important. So, all right, those 2 studies were actually based on this composite carbohydrate quality index. So which aspect of that is best predicting nutrient adequacy? And my hypothesis is that the glycemic index is a shortcut to a nutritious diet. So I say this because high GI foods often have low nutritional value, often. So think white bread, think jasmine rice, all right? People are quick to demonize soft drinks, but they never demonize rice, and yet we get, in some countries, 40% of our calories from white rice. 40%, not 10 or 20%, 40%. And many nutritious foods, on the other hand, have a low GI. So if you think of most fruits and dairy foods and most dense grain, whole kernel breads that you see labelled as low GI, they're very nutritious. But then again, what we've been told and criticised for is that low GI advice may limit food choices. We're telling people to limit the number of possible foods in their diet. And of course, as they often say, many indulgence foods like chocolate and ice cream have a low GI. So we might be, by saying eat low GI, are we encouraging people to eat indulgence foods and avoid potatoes? Okay? All right, so I'm going to try and answer that question. So a study in Australian children, it was a national survey, so it's highly representative of children across this, the whole of Australia in terms of socioeconomic groups and ages. The nutrient intake data was collected by 2 24-hour computer-aided telephone interviews. And what we did, we looked at the GI as a predictor of failing to meet the nutrient reference values, NRVs, or it's the same as your recommended dietary intakes in Australia. So 4,000 children altogether, and what you can see across quartiles of glycemic index is that the higher the GI, the fourth quartile, the higher the odds of failing to meet calcium, iodine, and vitamin A recommended dietary allowances. All right? The higher the GI, the higher the failure of meeting those recommended intakes. So, and when you looked at fat, all right, so GI is a predictor of fat quality. Fat predicted a decreased risk, GI predicted a decreased risk of failing to meet the fatty acid nutrient reference values. So in the highest quartile of glycemic index, you had a lower risk of failing to meet the fatty acid intakes, and that applied to saturated linoleic acid, I think, and then the long-chain puffer fatty acids. So if you ate high GI, you were probably having good fats, okay? And that's possibly because they were eating very low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets, but they were based on high glycemic index foods. And interestingly, there was absolutely no relationship between GI and fiber intake across all 4 quartiles of glycemic index. And you can see that most of them are close to meeting their recommended levels, just close to 1. Okay, so next study, nutrient adequacy in pregnancy. Pregnancy increases nutrient requirements, and all the nutrient recommended reference intakes are higher. Many women, however, have inadequate intakes. We have had a study published already called the Pregio study. You can see why it was called Pregio. We actually gave either low GI dietary advice or conventional healthy diet advice that was matched in macronutrients and matched in dietary fiber content with the low GI advice. So the only difference between them, in theory, was the GI. So there were 566 healthy women in this study, healthy pregnancies, and they recorded their food intake in 3-day food records at baseline, which was on entry to the study, averaged about 18 weeks gestation, and again at 36 weeks gestation. So then what we did, and this is in collaboration with Annette Buchan from the University of Bonn, we did a cross-sectional analysis and a change-on-change analysis of the relationship between all the carbohydrate factors and nutrient intake. So changes in micronutrient intake from food according to energy, starch, sugar, fiber, GI, GL, adjustment for age, adjusted for age, ethnicity, pre-pregnancy, BMI, and whatever intervention group they'd been assigned to. So these people are getting healthy dietary advice. So we're looking at it at baseline and then after five 1-hour visits with a dietitian. So prevalence of inadequate intake was extremely high, but we're looking at just at the food and not at supplements. And we're deliberately leaving out supplements because we're trying to look at the quality of the food as a quality of the diet. So you can see there they're pretty high. There's obviously a necessity for supplements during pregnancy, and the dietetic advice didn't really actually improve those factors. All right, what we found in Pregio was that the glycemic index of the diet, the glycemic load of the diet, the starch in the diet, adjusted for energy and differences, was inversely related to micronutrient intake. on a cross-sectional basis and on a change-on-change prospective basis. So this is just an example of folate intake in the highest quartile of glycemic index. They had the lowest intake of folic acid, okay, and highly significant, adjusted for all those things that you saw in the previous slide. The same applied to calcium, but not quite as steep. The highest quartile of glycemic index had the lowest calcium intake. And the same applied across many or most of the micronutrients, not always statistically significant, but always in that direction. All right, so then we did studies of the same concepts in gestational diabetes. And gestational diabetes is a little different to healthy pregnancy because they're actually trying to moderate the carbohydrate intake. And in some women, that means reducing the carbohydrate intake. And so then you've got this delicate balance going on between if you're going to reduce carbohydrate intake and what happens, you know, to the rest of the diet? What happens to micronutrient intake as a result? So methodology, what we did, participants were 82 participants categorized into energy-adjusted tertiles of GI, GL, carbohydrate intake, grain intake, and cereal product intake. So we're looking at various markers of carbohydrate quality. We calculated the mean intake, nutrient intake in each tertile, and then we looked at the linear associations across tertiles of glycemic index or carbohydrate with micronutrients. So first of all, many women, again, did not meet the nutrient reference values. So this is women with GDM, and you can see that nearly 100% of the women don't meet the intake for iron, recommended intake for iron. All right, okay, looking at tertiles of GI. What you can see here is B1, B2, vitamin D, iron, zinc, and vitamin E. And I should say that we don't fortify our diet with vitamin D. We've got lots of sunlight, thank you. The other nutrient that is compulsory fortified in bread is iodine. Other than that, there's no compulsory fortification. Oh, wait a minute, B1 is fortified in bread. And so what you can see is across the tertiles, you've got reduced intakes of B2, vitamin D, and vitamin E, and those trends are statistically significant. In tertiles of glycemic index for vitamin A, calcium, potassium and sodium, you can see that calcium's statistically significant. So again, the higher the tertile of glycemic index, the lower the micronutrient intake, but not always statistically significant. Carbohydrate, so now it's no longer tertiles of glycemic index, it's tertiles of carbohydrate intake. You can see there that the micronutrients, sometimes they're going down as you increase carbohydrate intake, but none of them was statistically significant. So carbohydrate content of the diet is not a marker, a predictor of micronutrient intake in the same way that glycemic index is. Other nutrients there with carbohydrate tertiles, you've got vitamin A, calcium, potassium, and sodium. And again, none of those associations are statistically significant. With cereal foods, okay, so we're looking at the breakfast cereals, looking at breads and grains like rice. You can see again, cereal foods, the higher the intake of cereal foods, the lower the micronutrient intakes. All right, and all statistically significant. Micronutrient intakes, again with cereal food intake, you can see again the relationship is either not there or it's sometimes statistically significant and again predicting lower micronutrient intake. So in women with GDM, higher intake of cereal products predicted lower intake of saturated fat, but also lower micronutrient intakes despite intensive dietary advice. So low GI was a more reliable indicator of diet quality. So that's possibly not surprising because we emphasized more fruit and dairy foods. Okay, so my take-home messages: improving fat may not improve dietary quality, all right? But improving carbohydrate quality does. But it's the aspect of carbohydrate quality that we should emphasize. GI is a better indicator of overall diet quality. It's better than carbohydrate intake per se, or grain, or fiber, or whole grain intake. And another mechanism, therefore, by which low GI foods, low GI diets may be associated with disease risk is not just that they lower postprandial glycemia and insulinemia, but also because they enrich the diet compared to what it was. So fears that dietary advice about the glycemic index may reduce food quality is unfounded, and my take-home message, GI is a shortcut to a healthy diet. Thank you.